Good morning, everybody. To those who are early risers and already here on site, but certainly also good morning to everybody who joined us online. This is the second day of our Think7 summit, and we already had a very productive day yesterday. We heard from Wolfgang Schmidt about the priorities of the G7 presidency and where the negotiations currently stand and what the expectations are. We also talked about the legitimacy and effectiveness of the G7 and how the G7 can work together with the G20. We discussed issues such as climate, finance, and economic recovery, and certainly also Russia's aggression towards Ukraine and what that means to the international community. And on all the panels we had yesterday, all panelists agreed that we need much more cooperation to tackle all the challenges we are facing in the world. But everybody also agreed that cooperation has become so much more difficult and this is also the title of our conference, in a contested geopolitical environment in which cooperation has become so much more difficult. We heard that we are facing a multitude of crises, simultaneous crises, which all interact with each other and enforce each other. The health crisis, which we haven't quite overcome yet with the pandemic, but there are also lots of other health issues looming at the horizon. The food security crisis, where we are facing the threat of a hugely increasing number of people in poverty and people facing hunger. The energy supply crisis, the climate crisis. We see an increasing number of more severe natural disasters all around the world, and hard security conflicts. And the list goes on and on and on. And the G7 has huge responsibility for its members, but way beyond that in the world. And the G7 can't do it alone. We heard that over and over again as well. It needs partners for this. And a group of very important partners are the international organizations. It's the World Bank, you think about immediately, the IMF, the WTO, but also very, very much UNCTAD. An organization which deals with trade issues, which deals with financial issues, which deals with poverty issues, and it is a particular pleasure to welcome Rebeca Grynspan today. She is the Secretary-General of UNCTAD. A very warm welcome to you, Secretary-General. It's a huge pleasure having you here today. Rebeca Grynspan became Secretary-General of UNCTAD only last year in fall, right in the middle of the pandemic. And I'm pretty sure you were hoping at the end of the year that we were kind of getting out of it. And now you're facing a new triple crisis of increasing food prices, hunger, and so on. I imagine that you imagined your presidency, your Secretary-Generalship, maybe a little bit differently. I met you first last year in fall at one of our Aspen conferences, and I thought that the Secretary-General is a real powerhouse. And that international affairs are in really good hands with her. She is the first woman who holds the UNCTAD Secretary-Generalship. And you were also Secretary-General, the first woman who headed the Ibero-America conference. And I found that so impressive that when we were putting together our Think7 summit, I said, we need to have her here. And we need to hear her expectations towards the G7 and the responsibility of the G7. So welcome very much to our Think7 summit. I will hand over in a second how we are going to conduct this today. We are going to hear from the Secretary-General, and then we have a Q&A session. So I'm not going to ask any Q&As of my own, but I'm counting on all of you in this room to share your comments, your insights, and your questions. And I also particularly want to ask that of our online participants. Don't be shy, just write in the chat function, and I have a co-moderator moderator here, Emily. She's monitoring the chat function, and then she's going to read out the Q&As for the Secretary General to answer. And without further ado, I hand over to you, and we are very much looking forward to your insights.
Thank you so much. I put my timer, so I will keep myself on time. And I really want to thank you for this warm welcome from your part. Being the first Secretary General in UNCTAD, or the first in the Ibero-American Summit, or Vice President in my country, you know, does not say that equality is coming, but that we still have inequality. Yes, because I would have liked to be the 200th one. But that has not happened yet. But thank you so much, really, to the Aspen Institute and to Think7 Summit for inviting me to give this important presentation at a moment that is so difficult for the world. As you said very well, Stormy, you know, we are in a moment of multiple crises, and we thought that 2022 will be the year of recovery from the pandemic, yes? And it was not so. We are even in a deeper crisis today because of the invasion of Russia to Ukraine and because of the war. And this is sending shock waves through three main channels to the world, yes? The food channel, the finance channel, and the energy channel, because the war in Ukraine is affecting these three dimensions very heavily in the world, and especially because it comes, as you said very clearly, you know, on top of the climate change crisis and on top of the COVID-19 pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic has left the world in a state of weakness, and I will refer to this very shortly. So let me start straight to share with you that the Secretary General of the UN has set up a crisis response, a global crisis response group for the crisis of the war in Ukraine. And he chairs a champions group with 6 heads of state and government. The Deputy Secretary General chairs the steering committee group, where you have the organizations of the UN and also the Bretton Woods organization, the IMF, the World Bank, WTO. And then there is the task team that we are doing and curating the information, the analysis in the 3 dimensions. So there are colleagues in each dimension of the crisis: food, finance, and energy. And I am coordinating that task team. That's how we are organized. And we will present our second brief. We presented a first brief already from this effort, and on Thursday, we will present our second brief. So I will share with you some information that is still embargoed. And so I won't go in all of the detail, but I think that I can present already, you know, what is our thinking with respect to what is happening. So in the first brief, we showed that the war in Ukraine sent these wave shocks, not only to the countries that are suffering because of the war so tremendously, and that is really heartbreaking, I have no other word, and the neighborhood countries that are receiving this influx of refugees, but it's also sending a much larger a wave to the rest of the world. And we said from the beginning that this is a global crisis, because the countries that are exposed to these dimensions are around 100 countries in the world. Around 1.6, 1.7 billion people are being affected by one of the dimensions in a severe way, or by the 3 dimensions together, yes? And that's why it's so important, this crisis response group at the global level, because we need to act together. We need to act collectively, because this is a global crisis, as you said. No country alone can really face this challenge. We will need the international community to come forward with actions that will allow to cushion the blow on people. So this second brief is centering its attention not only in countries that we did in the first, but on people, what is happening to people. So my first message is that this war has trapped the world between a rock and a hard place. Yes, because the rock is the rising cost of living. We are naming this crisis a cost of living crisis. Yes, it's not only, and a lot of attention in the world has been centering around food, but it's not only food, because if it's a cost of living crisis, you have households and families losing real income. Yes, their purchasing power is being affected, and they will have to choose at some point if to spend in health, if to spend in energy, or if to spend in food. Yes, and that's the problem. It's a cost of living crisis for the households, for the families. But on the other hand, it's not only a crisis, a cost of living crisis, but our ability to cope with the crisis. That is what we put attention to in the second brief. You know, there are countries that are exposed to this, to the impacts of this war, but they can cope. They have reserves, they have savings, they have high incomes that allows them to cope with the crisis. But for a lot of these 1.6, 1.7 billion people, yes, you know, they don't have the ability to cope, and countries are in a weaker position to help them to cope because of the interconnected, or of the multiple crises at the same time. A lot of the countries really lost a lot of what they could do, yes, in terms of fiscal space, in terms of their reserves, in terms of their debt burdens and loans. They exhausted their instruments already in the pandemic. And so this crisis finds countries and finds households in a weaker position to cope with the crisis. And that's why we say we are between a rock and a hard place with respect to this a crisis that comes on top of the others. And so a shock of this magnitude, yes, these multiple crises would have been a massive challenge no matter its timing, yes. But now we say it is of historic, century-defining proportions. How we will deal with it will really, you know, in a way, fix our future, you know, in many dimensions. So let me go through certain facts. Yes, this is my first important message. The first fact is that today, according to the FAO index, price index on food, we are in the highest level this index have had since we are recording it. It is even higher than what we had in 2008, 2009, where we had 60 countries going into social unrest because of the high prices of food. So here again, there is this correlation between high prices of the food index and social unrest, social malaise in countries. And we are raising, you know, the awareness that this can start to happen. Some countries already is happening, and that we are very worried about this correlation and the possibility of a wider social unrest in many countries. Energy prices overall are expected to rise 50% this year, according to the World Bank, and the crude oil still is above $110 a barrel, and nobody is expecting this to go down in an important way. So the challenge in terms of the energy transition, yes, because on the one hand, this is a push for renewables, but at the same time, because of the energy crisis, many are going back to fossil fuels, to carbon, and so we are seeing this tension between accelerating a transformative agenda and, on the other hand, making use of whatever you have at hand in terms of fossil fuels and in carbon. Fertilizers, that is the fourth F in this crisis. Fertilizer prices today are more than double the average of the last 20 years, more than double. And so this sets in motion a possible crisis for the future. Yes, the next harvest will be affected, and especially small farmers that will not be able to access fertilizers for the next harvest. And I will give you some data with respect to that. And the other factor in this cost of living crisis is the maritime transport costs that have more than tripled since the pre-COVID era. And here is where we also see the disruption in the global value chain, in the global value chain processes, because of the very high maritime cost. And obviously, this crisis, because of the war, is not only because of the high prices of energy that affect maritime costs, but also because of the destruction of the infrastructure in Ukraine and the Black Sea. Yes, and so this is an on top a very hard disruption on the global value chains, on maritime costs. So if you put this together, we are alarmingly, I would say, seeing already what we call a vicious cycle of prices, yes, that is starting to emerge, because these crisis channels of transmissions go from one to the other, yeah? So higher fuel prices increase the cost of transport and fertilizers, which increase the cost of production, which reduces farm yields, which increases prices once more, which in turn further add to inflation metrics, increasing on top of that interest rates, and then pressuring the macroeconomic stability of many countries, yes, because tightening financial conditions. So this is the vicious cycle that is emerging that we are worried about, because tighter financial conditions finally, affect the ability of countries to cope, to help their vulnerable, to help their poor. We are seeing important devaluations in the developing countries' currency that on top, make prices higher. And so you have an increase on their food and energy import costs, reducing further their fiscal space and increasing the cost of their debt. So in a way, this is the panoramic and that we have to have in mind. I won't go into all the other parts of this economic, because we could go, oh, my clock is not, we could go in detail on what this means, yes, in terms of the specific problems that we are seeing. So let me give you some tweets for your Q&A, yes? Because what we are saying is that the people are at the center of this cost of living crisis. We are already seeing the effects on households. Just for you, for example, to have in your mind, for the 20%, from the 20% lower income households, yes, an increase of 10% in food prices represents, you know, an erosion of 5% in their budget. So 5% in their budget is all what they spend in health. For you to, you know, for us to understand what is, you know, the impact that they are receiving. And obviously we are already seeing women and girls more affected because women and mothers are the first to skip a meal, you know, when this crisis, this type of crisis arises. And we are seeing an increase in the energy poor in the world. I am finalizing by my last message is that all the regions of the world are affected. Is sub-Saharan Africa, but is also the Middle East and the north of Africa, is also Central America and the Caribbean, the small island developing states everywhere are very affected, and they feel the pressure, yes, of in their ability to subsidize food prices, to import goods, to maintain macroeconomic stability, and at the end, you know, to try to maintain a stable society with all these pressures coming at the same time. So thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Secretary General. I think this is first an applause. You were already, yeah. I know that you do have to leave on time, but would you give us another 5 minutes until 9:35?
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much. Then I would like to ask you and I already see the first hand up, I think we collect a few questions and then hand over one more time to the Secretary General for a last round of answers. And I see Claudia Schmucker, DGRP, one of the partners of the Think7. Come on up, and Axel Berger, another one of our main organizers, coming after Claudia.
Thank you, Secretary General. That was very insightful, even though it was very depressing to hear all the facts that you stated. We have been speaking a lot about international cooperation and how this is needed, and that the role that the G7 can play is to lead by example. What would you expect from the Elmau summit to help especially poor and developing countries who are affected? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your keynote, Secretary General. Axel Berger from the German Development Institute. I would be interested in where would you start to interrupt or disrupt this vicious cycle that you described? What are the institutions, the forums, where we need cooperation? What are the topics? Where would you start? You've mentioned several topics like inflation, food crisis, and so on. So where would you start to stop this vicious cycle?
Hi, Maylin Frang from the People-Centered Internet USA, Silicon Valley. While there's fear about technology, can digital help at this time of crisis?
And Johannes.
Addressing your trade portfolio, Biden was in Japan yesterday kind of presenting his IPEF proposal. Is that just the counter narrative to the regional comprehensive economic partnership? And is this, let's say, helping to relieve the pressure at a time of crisis, or what do you see? What kind of role does the new proposal has in international trade?
And asking Emily, do we have any online? Yes, we do.
It just came in, so I need to read it, unfortunately. One question is, how can rule-based trade highlight the importance of human rights in trade?
Great, thank you so much. Any more questions? This is your chance. No, but I think it's a bouquet of questions already. So I hand back to the Secretary General.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. This gives me the opportunity of what I didn't say. First to Claudia and what we expect from the G7. I know that this is a very harsh panorama, the one that I presented, yes, but let me send this message. We have the instruments to try to stop, this vicious cycle. And the instruments are in the international financial system. First of all, I will expect from the G7 the flexibilities that we need in the instruments. And let me put forward some of them. Yes, we need flexibility in terms of access to the emergency windows of the World Bank and the IMF. We need flexibility with respect to the surcharges in interest rates on those countries that are already above their quota and they are charged with surcharges of interest rates. We will need to expand the quota of the countries. So many of them are already in the max of the quota that they can ask from the IMF. So we need flexibility there. We need that expansion for these institutions to be able, as they did at the initial stages of the pandemic, to respond in an emergency mode, in a very rapid way of disbursement. We need to increase the availability of funds on the poverty, on the growth and poverty trust fund, the PRGT in the IMF. We need to operationalize very quickly, yes, the resilient and sustainability trust that is the new instrument that have been put forward for the long-term transformation in the IMF. We will need to from the G20, if the G7 pushes for it, we will need to extend the debt suspension initiative for the countries that had access to the DSSI. And we will need to make operational the common framework for debt restructuring, because we are at the brink of a domino effect of developing countries defaulting under debt because of this new crisis. So we need the debt instruments that we have. They are not the best. Let me be very frank. Yes, the capacity of the debt architecture that we have now to really face this crisis is not where we want to be. But at least let's use what we have to really cushion the blow and to really make available the liquidity on the one hand, and and avoiding the solvency crisis that many of the countries can go for. My second, so the G7 is essential in this. I think that ODA has to go very importantly, obviously, to development and the humanitarian crisis. But all the elements that I am giving you now don't require more fiscal effort from the G7. What they require is political will to put the flexibilities that the system needs to respond quickly. So this is a very important part. In the international system, we have other things that we need. And some of you made, sorry, made the mentioned the issue of trade, yes? And part of the problem is that we are making the situation worse because many countries are putting restrictions on trade, on exports, and you have heard the last one was India, but we had many others, Indonesia, etc. in the middle. So it's happening. What happened also with the vaccine crisis? Yes, that you already have a problem in the global value chains, and then you put restrictions on exports, and so you make things even worse for the world. Trade, we need trade to flow as freely as possible in this situation, precisely to ameliorate the impact that trade is having on the population and on countries. This is a trade crisis, yes, because all the dimensions we are talking about, fuel and fertilizers and food, yes, is are transported through trade. Yes, all this impact. So trade is at the center of this crisis, and we need to fight these restrictions and allow trade to really flow much better. What other institutions we need here? Obviously, we need the G20 to function, yes, and to take decisions in many of these these issues. If the G7 will, agree on these elements to be able to cope with the financial crisis, so the G20 will go farther also in the possibilities of what they have to do, despite the geopolitics, the geoeconomics that we are seeing. There was this question about technologies and trade and human rights. With respect to technologies, technologies, for example, in the energy transformative agenda, yes, technologies are playing a key role. Yeah, the problem that we are having to press even further for the projects and the investments in renewable energy, where technologies are really providing a level playing field for these investments with respect to other to fossil fuels and other energy possibilities. The problem is that the global value chains on goods and equipment and inputs for the renewable energy projects are also very disrupted right now, especially because of China lockdowns and problems with COVID. And so prices of these inputs and equipment are going up and are affecting the new projects on renewables. And this is something that we are looking very specifically to try to take away some of the bottlenecks that are affecting the energy transition from that point of view. And digitalization in terms of technologies, the whole issue of trade facilitation through digitalization and the digital economy, e-commerce, is a very important part also of the answers, not only for the short term, but also for the long term that we have to look for. And the human rights question. Yes, there is. We are writing a piece on food and human rights in the present situation with the human rights people, and there is a lot to be said there and to put in the center also of the trade negotiations. Now that we will have the MC12, the ministerial conference of WTO, that we hope will bring some answers to these issues and to the intellectual property right issue, yes, that somebody asked me about, where there is already a text for a flexibilization of the TRIPS agreement. We have been pushing for a waiver. The waiver is it doesn't seem to be on reach, but at least again, if the flexibilization of the TRIPS agreement can go a long way, facilitating the production of vaccines in Africa and in many countries, because we need to diversify the production infrastructure in the world, in different regions, preparing for the future. So here, let me say that there is something that I say many times, yes, and that is that the short and the long term start at the same time. The long term is not a successive row of short terms, and how we implement the policies in this moment will set up what we will have in the future. If we will go towards the Agenda 2030, the climate change agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals, depends on how we design and the decisions we are gonna take today, because it will affect the long term and the ability of households and countries to take the right decisions for the long term still be a hopeful future for all of us.
Thank you so very, very much, Secretary General. We heard your alarm going on. We are sure that you have to go to your next meeting. This has been amazing. Thank you so much for laying out a clear agenda also and your expectations for the G7. Yesterday, we heard Wolfgang Schmidt saying from the Chancellery, this is not an easy G7 presidency. I think this is what you showed to us again by laying out all those crises, the interdependencies, how they fuel each other. This is really not an easy G7 presidency. I hope you're going to be right. Oh, well, you didn't say, well, actually you didn't say if the G7 is going to live up to your expectations. I hope they are going to live up to what you said is needed: more flexibility, rapid responses, and political will. Thank you very, very much. I'm heartened that we have such a leader as you at the head of such an organization which plays such an important role. So if somebody can get the international community together, it's going to be you. So we have big hope also on you and UNCTAD, and thank you so much for joining us today. And with this, we let you go. And one more big applause before I hand over to Axel again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
We need your help. The research institutions, the civil society mobilization will be key. So thank you very much.